Yeah.
So you'll be able to see my screen right now, right? Refugees with guns, 老兵 with phallus. 老兵 means old soldiers. Veterans, Ghosts of Taiwan, circa 1949. It's sort of a long paper. I'll have to skip around. If you're interested in its entirety, you probably have to wait patiently for 2 years. It'll be published by the Wenshan Review. That's WENSHAN, the Wenshan Review in 2024. Clearly, they have a huge backlog. Approximately 1 million nationalists, 国民党, mainland Chinese and their families under Generosimo Chiang Kai-shek. By the way, do you think you can just give me a holler, interrupt me when I have only 1 minute left? I don't really want to take too much time. There's still a second speaker and a Q&A, so please interrupt me any way you can, rather than just sort of type me an email. Very often, I don't really get to see it. Thank you.
Yes.
So they retreated with Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan in 1949, having lost China to the communist troops under Chairman Mao Zedong. Taiwan had recently emerged from Japanese colonization of 1895 to 1945, with a population mostly of Fujian, Guangdong, and Hakka descent, whose ancestors had migrated across the Taiwan Strait during the Ming and Qing dynasties, subduing the indigenous Austronesian peoples. And let me see if I can move. Okay. The historical conundrum of Taiwan, thus, culminates in 1949, when nationalist soldiers arrived with their weapons and young families. Was this flood of military personnel and civilians and occupation force taking over control from the Japanese Empire and from southern China's settler colonizers of aboriginal lands? Were they war refugees? Were they both? Or something else altogether, awaiting half a century later their proper name? The conundrum of their historical identity crystallizes in my late mother's memory when she always reluctantly shared snatches, themselves stylized, from her saga of Tao Nan. The well-worn phrase of fleeing disaster, deployed by her generation of mainland Chinese to describe their escape from the Japanese first and then the Chinese communists of the 1930s and 40s. Tao Nan is a lexicon seared in the Chinese consciousness because it recurs throughout millennia of dynastic history with endless wars and waves of refugees. A young mother of a toddler whose second child perished months after birth for reasons unknown, she and my father jostled with the masses at the Guangzhou dock, trying to board any ship bound for Taiwan before the communist attack. I recall her frenzied eyes and hands and voice as though shaking still after all those years, when she described how the crowd fought on the gangplanks to the ship, many falling into the sea. In total despair, they suddenly spotted my father's Huangpu Military Academy classmate, Zhu Jingfeng, Zhu, Gold, Peak. That's the literal translation of his name. An army officer commanding his squad of Qiangbing, armed soldiers, literally gun soldiers. Zhu ordered his soldiers to commandeer a boat, ferrying my parents and eldest brother to the far side of the ship for boarding. Without Zhu and his gunmen, I would not have been born, at least not in Taiwan. Had I been born and come of age in China to an ex-nationalist family during the Cultural Revolution, I would not be writing this in English as a foreign-born American academic. Every Lunar New Year when I was growing up in Taiwan, Zhu was our honored guest since he stayed a bachelor for years, a factory foreman in a remote town of Tucheng, Dirt City. which suggested to a child's imagination how far he had fallen, from his namesake tip-top to the ground. The child also came to see foreman as possibly the parents' euphemism for doorman. Throughout my childhood, I had difficulty deciphering his heavy accent, nor the patience to follow his slow, labored speech. How could Taiwanese-speaking workers on the factory floor understand their foreman's instructions? He lost all his pensions and assets in a failed marriage to a young Taiwanese or indigenous wife, plus his jaw due to a botched surgery. So heavily bandaged was he one Lunar New Year that he could hardly eat. Our savior, Uncle Zhu, soon vanished. His gun soldiers might have fared even worse in Taiwan had they made it across. Dubbed by Wu Zhuoliu as Orphan of Asia, Taiwan has long been a convenient way station for the Portuguese, Dutch, Spanish, British, Japanese, and even dynastic Chinese colonizers to stop and replenish, or even to settle, ever since the 16th century. Taiwan has been the foundling, fathered and abandoned by these foreign masters, the last one in 1949, claiming to be Taiwan's biological father. This essay focuses on novels and short stories, personal historical accounts, and films of that fraught moment when refugees, some with guns, fled to Taiwan for dear life, crushing other lives in their wake. Their settling in unsettled those who had already settled there, a karmic cycle entirely man-made. Specifically, I explored the shared literary and filmic motif of Lao Bing, old soldiers or nationalist veterans, in the plural or the singular, as pedophiles, perverts, and phantoms, represented largely by second-generation 外省人 or mainlander writers. Many of these old soldiers or veterans, armed no longer with guns, but fetishized as phantasmagoric phalluses, had relocated to Taiwan without much education and life skills, some of whom even drafted at gunpoint in China, the so-called snatched soldiers, one of the most wretched groups in post-war Taiwan without money and family. Lao Bing, sexual predators, displays the ambivalent subconsciousness of nationalist refugees with guns and that of their children. Both of them project their collective trauma and sin onto the scapegoat in their midst, also transfer onto Lao Bing precisely because of their disempowerment is 外省人's awareness of their own increasing irrelevance to Taiwan or Taiwanese-centric politics and culture. So goes the historical irony of host/age. So it's both host and hostage. Like any foreign body multiplying itself in a host body, one becomes the host by taking hostage the natives and their land. The Ouroboros of time, in the form of rise and fall, death and rebirth, would eventually loop back, as it has for 外省人, devouring that which used to devour. Although deemed strangers ill-adapted to the island, Lao Bing serendipitously embody Taiwan, the orphan ghost that come in handy as tropes since they can be unhanded anon. 外省人 and Taiwanese writers do unto Lao Bing, the sacrificial lamb straitjacketed in wolf's clothing, what China and the international community have done unto Taiwan. And let me try to skip quite a bit because of time. What I did was really skipped all the things that I used in terms of Antonia Chow and other people's sociological studies. So I go from that to literary representation. Antonia Chow's realistic portrayal of Lao Bing's lifelong dilemma parallels literary representations of Lao Bing by 外省人, foreign province people, writers, mostly second-generation Taiwanese writers of mainland Chinese descent. Many were born and raised in Taiwan, quite a few in Juancun, military dependence villages dotted across Taiwan to accommodate the flood of mainlanders. The moniker of 外省人 aims to distinguish the subjects from 本省人, this province people. Taiwanese residents whose ancestors arrived from Fujian, Guangdong, and other mainland provinces long before 1949, some as early as 18th and 19th century. 外省人, or second-generation writers, coalesce around a envisioning of Lao Bing at a turn of a century as a collective root searching to counteract, even if subconsciously, 本省人, or Taiwanese writers' home soil or nativist movements. As 本省人formed their ethnic identity and took over governance through democratic elections, 外省人, approximately 10% of the 23 million Taiwanese, felt compelled to claim their own heritage. In modernizing majority rural Taiwan, the disappearance of obsolete housing, project-style 眷村, and other 外省人 symbols, most of all the nationalist-dominated government, came to inspire second-generation writers to launch nostalgic backward glance. That literary and artistic glance converges around Lao Bing as pedophiles, perverts, and phantoms is already foreshadowed by Antonia Chow's sociological treatises, unwittingly skirting all three P's, to be read in Mandarin's fourth tone, P's, for farts, in the plural, unseemly, malodorous, undesirable, yet recurring outbursts from the bottom, pun intended, of Taiwan's humanity. At a minimum, Lao Bing are symptomatic of Taiwan's digestive problems, a case of constipation, so to speak, after having consumed snatched soldiers and extracted their sweet youth. More broadly, Lao Bing stands as a clue to the endemic malaise of the Ghost Island's traumatic history and culture. Given the fact that Lao Bing lived on largely through 外省人 writers and artists, i.e., children of refugees with guns, my openings projecting their collective trauma and sin onto the scapegoat ought to be revised as post-trauma and original sin. After all, few of these chroniclers of Lao Bing have experienced the cross-strait flight themselves, nor were they grown up enough to enact nationalist, discriminatory policies to personally, systematically sin against the Taiwanese population. Yet faced with the aging of the first-generation mainlanders, the dissipation of 眷村, and the erosion of other nationalist icons, they reconstruct the past through a race to the bottom, as it were. The abominable Lao Bing existence signals 外省人's elegy for themselves, mourning the demise, yet paradoxically sounding like the mea culpa for past sins or transgressions against the deceased as well as the living, against mainlanders as well as Taiwanese. Although narrated oftentimes from the Lao Bing perspective and set in their lives, these Lao Bing stories have less to do with Lao Bing than with second-generation 外省人 writers themselves, less to do with Lao Bing memories than with 外省人's perversion of post-memory, as Marianne Hirsch defines it. And let me see if I can skip a little bit more. So I go to the very first type that I was looking at, Lao Bing as pedophiles. And the best quote is really from Zhu Tianxin. Seminal to Lao Bing representations or misrepresentations Zhu Tianxing's autobiographical essay, Thinking of My Junshun Brothers, unfolds in a stop-and-go fashion for 23 pages, 3 of which are devoted to Lao X, OX, so named with an English letter in a Chinese original, a veteran from the Nationalist Army, an alleged pedophile, guilty until proven innocent. Zhu Tianxing condemns these Laobing, codenamed OX, with anecdotal evidence. Undoubtedly, some of these old soldiers were unscrupulous, even malevolent. Bad apples exist in every corner of society. Yet, to stigmatize all old soldiers in such a broad stroke betrays psychological scapegoating, which exercises Zhu's and the second-generation Weissenren's own fear, guilt, and shame. The naming of OX joins the negativity of aging with a placeholder X for the unknown, thus for every single Laobing. Zhu's naming is name-calling. Laobing from China, languishing amongst the Taiwanese population, are xenophobically othered and anglicized in such a way that it denotes mystery in English, doubly so for non-English speakers. Zhu imagines that on the wedding night of an imaginary Juanchun woman on the verge of conjugal intimacy, she would suddenly recall not only her childhood crush, Brother Bao, in, quote, her father's military undershirt, but also Lao X from her childhood Juanchun, one impending watershed moment that turns a young woman into a married woman, triggers a long-buried traumatic memory of sexual knowledge involving 2 father figures, especially the latter, the bad Laobing father. Zhu nicknames this woman, let's call her Xiaoling, whose childhood shame emerged when several daredevil Juanchun boys in Zhu's narration peeked from Lao X's window. And there's the quote you have on the screen. They usually see Lao X and Xiaoling doing strange things. Either he strips or he strips off Xiaoling's clothes and pants. Because of impotence or caution, these Lao X's won't go so far as to make Xiaoling bleed or to be found out by the mother at the evening bath. While listening to the story or playing Chinese chess, these boys would be dazed, staring at Lao X's crotch, recalling his big cock. Without passing any judgment, they just feel, fuck, what a king of the beasts. Naming the molester Lao, old, and the molested Xiao, little, set the stage of pedophilia. Yet self-contradiction remains. Lao X's alleged impotence and colossal penis, which stems from fetishizing Laobing as an ambivalent phallic symbol that is both there and not there, that is larger than life and symbolically castrated. Zhu's essay, alas, becomes one of the 2 sources, more anecdotal than factual, more literary than historical, for the historian Dominique Young to damn all old soldiers as sex predators. And I quote, many of the young, the mentally handicapped, and the impoverished became targets of the old soldiers' sexual advances and molestation. Such a monumental historic project on the forgotten genesis of mainlanders in Taiwan, such slapdash reliance on Zhu's hearsays, such cavalier conviction of Laobing en masse. And let me just jump to the second type, which is Laobing as perverts. And I quote from Bai Xianyong, wandering in the garden, waking from a dream. And let me just skip a little bit more for the sake of time. First of all, I introduce a particular character, Lao Yang. Once again, Lao Yang, And then I go on to analyze this particular story, A Sea of Blood-Red Azaleas. In Bai's magnum opus, Wandering in the Garden, Waking from a Dream, Lao Yang-esque, Wang Xiong, that's the character's name, Wang Xiong, has already charted the lowest hell into which Lao Bing characters are prone to fall. Despite its original Chinese title, Taipei People, Taipei Ren, Bai's collection of short stories focuses on the mainlanders stranded between nostalgia for China and their youth on the one hand, and on the other, aging and decay in Taipei. From the home soil perspective, Taipei's characters are non-Taipei people, their hearts lying elsewhere, their bodies poisoned cups of memory and melancholia. Wang Xiong in A Sea of Blood-Red Azaleas, translated by Bai Xianyong and another person, embodies not only Lao Bing, but spans all three P's under discussion, an early prototype of the controversial representations by the second generation. And I'm quoting from the screen. Wang Xiong was originally a peasant boy from the Hunan countryside, trotting off to town to sell the 2 baskets of grains on his carrying pole. The minute he stepped outside his village, it was taken away. The snatched soldier winds up serving the narrator's relatives in Taipei. Owing to the class difference, this obsession has never had the opportunity to fester into pedophilia, for the willful young master mocks and dismisses him in English, which Wang Xiong could not understand. You are a dog, italicized because it's in English. The young master then switches to Chinese, which Wang does understand. He looks like a big gorilla, a put-down resonating with his namesake, Xiong, for bear. Such slights turn Wang Xiong into a morose pervert of sorts, silently watering blood-red azaleas that used to be the young master's favorite. In the wake of a family maid taking up the taunt, big gorilla, Wang assaults her, leaving her unconscious, and I quote, her skirt ripped to shreds, naked to the waist, her breasts covered with bruises and scratches, a ring of finger marks around her neck, as though mauled by a beast. After Wang Xiong's bloated, fish-nibbled body is retrieved from the Keelung seashore, the young master's mother believes, and I quote again, every night someone waters the garden, resulting in azaleas exploding in riotous bloom as if a chestful of fresh blood suddenly had shot forth from an unstanchable wound and splayed the whole garden, leaving marks and stains everywhere, blood red. The representation of Wang Xiong spans the fall of a masochistic, pseudo-pedophiliac slave into a perverted beast savaging a maid, and finally into a ghost watering azaleas that his beloved used to love. Reminiscent of Zhu Tianxin, sleight of hand over their essay and short story title, Bai's aesthetic ending sublimates Lao Bing's spilled blood into beauty. And let me just go to the very last kind. I think my time is about to wind down. The last kind, of course, is Lao Bing as phantoms, as ghosts, which, of course, the previous story has already touched on. The physical presence of Lao Bing as pedophiles and/or perverts in literature of the late 20th century and early 21st century enjoys a digital and cinematic afterlife, virtual and phantom-like, in Taiwan's video game Detention, 返校, launched in 2017, and a subsequent eponymous film in 2019. The franchise of Detention does not cancel out literary representations of Lao Bing as phantoms, because there's quite a few examples of that. Outstripping thousands of words, however, is a single image from the film Detention. Meet Uncle Gao, the Lao Bing and high school janitor with one eye gouged out. You can barely see it, but that's one eye gouged out, and front teeth pulled by the White Terror police interrogators for this alleged treason and communist sabotage in sharing the school storeroom keys with a reading group in a secret, prohibited night gatherings. Out of a film unfolding in a female ghost's repetition compulsion, fraught with trite conceits of the horror genre, only one character shocks and repels viewers via frontal, facial mutilation. No other character, neither the student protagonist, come female ghost, Fan, nor her love interest teacher, Zhang, nor teacher Wei in the love triangle, nor any other member of the reading group countenances such distortion from which viewers would instinctively recoil. Before turning around for public viewing in this figure, Uncle Gao, his back to the camera, drinks and throws dice in a big rice or noodle bowl, mumbling to himself. Sins such as alcohol and gamble are endemic among the have-nots in an attempt to anesthetize the pain of living and to dream of striking it rich. In a Shandong accent, sprinkled with a constant refrain of "an" for I, Uncle Gao grumbles under his breath that he had fought with the troops in China and loves the party, the Nationalist Party, that is, only to be relegated to the abjection of janitorial duties, trading access to the storeroom for a few cigarettes. The reference to cigarettes is not accidental, since the nationalist policeman's roughing up of an illegal cigarette vendor at Taipei's railway station on February 28, 1947, caused a chain reaction of the White Terror. For this alleged crime, viewers witness in the next shot that Gao's eyes were hollowed out, half his face in a bloody pulp, and several front teeth extracted. The horror is foreshadowed by a close-up of the bowl containing not dice, but bloody teeth, as though cloned from the Lord of the Rings, Treebeard. A mammoth tree man in high school teacher officer Bai's uniform and cap would soon strangle Gao to death, whereas members of the reading group would all be suspected of communist sabotage, arrested and tortured in prison, bloodied and waterboarded. None of them manifests Gao's frontal defacement. Younger characters, students and teachers alike, are afforded cinematic decency, some blood stains and bruises notwithstanding. By contrast, stomach-churning, nauseating abomination is reserved for the most unbecoming character from the lowest run of the society, Lao Bing. I think I should just stop right here. I think I've run out of time. Thank you.